The FIA did not just confirm a rule change. It confirmed the fear. Mercedes had found gray areas serious enough to force action. The hot engine loophole was closed. The emergency hybrid trick was banned. The front wing behavior was investigated. And then, after all of that, Kimi Antonelli still beat Max Verstappen to Monaco pole by 43 thousandths of a second. That is the part nobody can explain away. Because if the FIA had already taken away the obvious tricks, why was Mercedes still fast enough to win the most brutal qualifying battle of the season? This is where the story gets dangerous. A reported 0.3 per lap engine advantage. A new hot test at 130 degrees Celsius. A banned emergency shutdown exploit. A power loss scare that involved Verstappen himself. And a 19-year-old Mercedes driver who still made Monaco look calm. So maybe Verstappen was right to be suspicious. Not because Antonelli's pole was erased. It was not. But because the FIA's own actions proved the Mercedes questions were never just rumors. They were real enough to police. And now the terrifying question is this. Did the FIA catch Mercedes' secret, or did it only confirm that Mercedes are already one step ahead of the rulebook? Subscribe to the channel. To understand why Verstappen's suspicion suddenly felt validated, you have to look at what the FIA actually did. Because the most important confirmation in Formula One does not always come from a dramatic punishment. Sometimes, it comes from a rule change. A new test. A technical directive. An investigation that tells the whole paddock one thing very clearly. There was something here worth checking. And that is exactly why the Mercedes story became so explosive after Monaco. The FIA did not throw out Antonelli's pole. The source material does not say his lap was illegal. It does not say Mercedes were disqualified from qualifying. It does not say Verstappen was handed pole after the session. That is not the point. The point is more subtle, and much more dangerous. The FIA had already acted on the kinds of Mercedes-related gray areas that rivals had been questioning. And then, after those actions, Mercedes still had enough pace to beat Verstappen in Monaco by 43 thousandths of a second. That margin is tiny. But the meaning behind it is enormous. Because Monaco was supposed to be the moment Mercedes became easier to understand. The hot engine controversy had already forced attention onto the power unit. The emergency hybrid trick had already been restricted. The front wing behavior had already been investigated. One by one, the most suspicious doors around the Mercedes car had either been pushed shut, clarified, or checked. So rivals expected something to change. They expected the W17 to lose part of its edge. They expected Antonelli to look a little less untouchable. They expected Verstappen to finally have a cleaner fight against a Mercedes car without the same cloud around it. But Monaco gave them the opposite feeling. Mercedes still looked sharp. Antonelli still looked calm. And Verstappen still ended up behind him on the timing screen. That is where the entire story begins. Not with a confirmed illegal lap, but with a confirmed uncomfortable truth. The FIA had changed the way it policed Mercedes' world, and Mercedes were still fast. To see why that matters, start with the engine. The new Formula One power unit rules created a different kind of challenge. Cars were no longer just about who could build the strongest combustion engine. They now had to balance combustion with electrical energy in a far more demanding way. Heat, deployment, recovery, efficiency, and timing all became part of the same puzzle. And Mercedes seemed to solve that puzzle before the rest of the grid. Antonelli was leading the Drivers' Championship. Russell was second. Mercedes were leading the Constructors' Championship. That kind of dominance is never treated as harmless inside the paddock, especially at the start of a new era. Because teams know how Formula One works. A car is not fast by accident. A driver does not keep finding time for no reason. A team does not dominate both championships because of luck. There is always a source. And rivals believed one source was hidden inside the engine's compression behavior. Compression ratio sounds like something only engineers care about, but the idea is simple. Inside the engine, air and fuel are squeezed before they burn. The tighter that mixture is squeezed, the more force it can release. It is like pressing down on a spring. Push it a little, and it barely jumps back. Push it harder, and the release becomes stronger. The rules limited that squeeze. 16:1. That was the maximum compression ratio. But the controversy was not only about the number. It was about the moment of measurement. According to the source material, the original checks measured the engine while it was cold, sitting in the pit lane, at ambient temperature. That sounds logical at first. The car is stationary. The test is controlled. Officials can measure the engine in a calm environment. But Formula One is not calm. A race engine does not reveal its true nature while resting. It reveals itself when it is hot, stressed, expanding, and operating under brutal loads. That is where the suspected Mercedes loophole lived. Rivals believed Mercedes had found a way for the engine to measure legally when cold, but behaved differently once it reached full operating temperature. Cold, the car appeared to comply. Hot, it allegedly acted as though the compression ratio had climbed beyond the intended limit. And this is where the FIA's action becomes so important. The governing body introduced hot engine checks at a representative operating temperature of 130 degrees Celsius. In plain English, it stopped asking only what the engine looked like in the garage. It started asking what the engine became when it was alive. That is the confirmation hidden inside the clampdown. If the cold test had been enough, the hot test would not have been necessary. If rivals had been imagining the problem, the FIA would not have needed a new way to measure it. The rule change did not say Antonelli's Monaco pole was illegal. It did not erase Mercedes' results. But it did confirm that the original system was not strong enough to answer the question everyone was asking. And that is what Verstappen's side of the battle would have noticed immediately. Because a new test means the FIA saw a gap. A gap in enforcement. A gap in measurement. A gap between what a car looks like when checked, and what it might become when racing. That is exactly the kind of gap top teams hunt for. And Mercedes appeared to have found it first. The reported performance gain was massive by Formula One standards. Up to 0.3 of a second per lap. 0.3 can change everything. It can turn a difficult qualifying into pole contention. It can give the driver cleaner air. It can help tires survive because the car does not need to be overdriven. It can change strategy because track position becomes easier to protect. Now compare that with Monaco. Antonelli beat Verstappen by 43 thousandths. 43 thousandths is not a gap. It is a knife edge. It is one tiny throttle input. One slightly cleaner exit. One fraction more trust over a curb. One breath less hesitation near a wall. That is why the paddock could not separate the pole from the controversy. Because when a team has been linked to a gain measured in tenths, and then wins the most important qualifying battle by thousandths, every technical question becomes louder. But here is the twist. By Monaco, the hot engine clampdown was supposed to be active. So if the compression loophole was the whole secret, Mercedes should have looked weaker. That was the expectation. That was the hope for rivals. And that was the moment Verstappen needed. If Mercedes dropped back, the story would make sense. The FIA closed the loophole, and the advantage disappeared. Verstappen and the rest of the field would know exactly what had been happening. But Mercedes did not give them that clean answer. Antonelli still took pole. And that created the more frightening possibility. Maybe the loophole helped Mercedes. But maybe it was not the foundation. Maybe the advantage was not one trick. Maybe it was a whole system. That is the idea that makes this story so dangerous, because a single loophole can be closed. A complete system cannot be removed with one directive. If Mercedes have built performance into the way the engine works with the hybrid deployment, the way the car behaves under braking, the way the airflow stays stable, and the way the tires come into the right window, then the FIA cannot simply write one sentence and make the car ordinary. That is why Verstappen's suspicion matters. Because he was not just watching a rival team from the outside. He was the driver directly beaten by Antonelli in Monaco. He was also one of the drivers affected by the dangerous hybrid power loss incidents earlier in the season. He had seen the Mercedes fight not only on the timing screen, but inside the reality of the new systems. So when the FIA confirmed through action that the gray areas needed policing, it gave weight to the concerns. Not proof that every Mercedes lap was illegal. Not proof that Antonelli's pole should be removed. But proof that the battleground itself was real. Temperature mattered. Hybrid behavior mattered. Front wing movement mattered. The way the car behaved under real track conditions mattered. And Mercedes had been living in those zones before the rest of the sport fully understood how to control them. That is why Monaco did not close the story. It opened the next chapter. Because if the FIA had acted, and Mercedes were still fast, then the rest of the grid had to stop asking only what Mercedes had done before. They had to start asking what Mercedes still had left. And that is a much more difficult question. A past loophole can be documented. A banned trick can be named. An investigated wing can be explained. But a remaining advantage, one that survives after the obvious issues have been addressed, becomes harder to catch, harder to copy, and harder to dismiss. That is what made Antonelli's pole so uncomfortable for Verstappen and every rival chasing Mercedes. It was not proof of guilt. It was proof that the mystery was still alive. The FIA had confirmed the gray areas were serious enough to act on. Verstappen had lost to the car after those actions. And Mercedes had shown that even when the rulebook starts closing in, they can still find enough performance to stay ahead. That is the real beginning of this story. Not a punishment. Not a disqualification. Not a stolen pole. Something more powerful. A question the paddock still cannot answer. If the FIA has already caught the obvious Mercedes tricks, why does the car still look like it has another answer waiting? But the engine was only the first part of what the FIA had effectively confirmed. Because once the governing body changes how it tests one area, the rest of the paddock does not stop there. It starts asking a more dangerous question. Where else did Mercedes find something? That is where the front wing came back into the conversation. At first, it looked like a completely different issue. The engine controversy was about heat, compression, and power. The front wing was about movement, airflow, and braking. But in Formula One, different systems are rarely separate for long. A car is one chain reaction. The engine changes the speed. The speed changes the air. The air changes the wing load. The wing load changes the balance. The balance changes the tires. And the tires change how much the driver dares to risk. That final part is everything at Monaco. Because Monaco is not won by a driver who is just fast in a straight line. It is won by a driver who trusts the car when the track gives him no space to doubt. The wall is always there. The curb is always waiting. The next corner arrives before the last one has fully left your mind. So when Antonelli looked calm on his pole lap, when he looked precise, when he looked like the Mercedes was giving him confidence in the places where other cars looked tense, rivals were always going to search for an explanation. And one of the earlier explanations they had already questioned was the front wing. During the Chinese Grand Prix weekend, footage of the Mercedes W17 raised concerns about how the front wing flaps behaved under braking. Rival teams noticed that the flaps appeared to remain in an intermediate position, not fully behaving the way they were expected to behave inside the required closing window. That sounds like a tiny detail. But Formula One is built from tiny details. A small movement at the front of the car can change how the air reaches the floor. It can change how stable the car feels when the driver turns in. It can change how much confidence the driver has when he hits the brake pedal at the last possible moment. The front wing is the first part of the car that touches the air. Think of it like the first person walking through a crowded doorway. If that person moves slightly to one side, everyone behind has to adjust. The whole flow changes because the first movement changed. That is what the front wing does. It decides the first direction of the air. And once that air is disturbed, everything behind it has to live with the consequences. So if a front wing behaves differently under braking, rivals notice immediately. Because braking is where a driver needs the car to feel stable, predictable, and honest. Especially at Monaco. A driver does not have time to argue with the car there. He cannot turn in and then wait to see if the rear is going to follow. He cannot add a little safety margin without giving away lap time. He has to trust that when he asks the car to rotate, the car will rotate. Antonelli drove like he had that trust. That does not prove the wing was illegal. And it matters to say that clearly. The FIA investigated the front wing concern and cleared Mercedes. According to the source material, the behavior was not judged as deliberate software manipulation. It was linked to insufficient hydraulic pressure, a design miscalculation that affected how the wing closed under certain air loads. No penalty was issued. But the investigation still mattered. Because in Formula One, an official clearance does not always remove the pressure. Sometimes it confirms that the behavior was unusual enough to deserve attention in the first place. And for Verstappen, Red Bull, Ferrari, and every team chasing Mercedes, that matters. They were not imagining that the car had unusual traits. They were seeing things that required explanation. That is the subtle confirmation. Not guilt. Not punishment. But confirmation that Mercedes had been operating in areas where the FIA had to look more closely. And when that comes after the engine clampdown, the story begins to feel connected. The engine question was about a car changing when hot. The wing question was about a part behaving unusually under load. Both point to the same bigger issue. What does the Mercedes become when it is no longer sitting still? That is the key. Because a Formula One car can look one way in a garage and behave another way at speed. The load changes. The temperature changes. The pressure changes. The airflow changes. The software decisions meet the physical world. And that is where the best teams search for performance. The FIA can measure a car when it is static. But the race is not static. The race is alive. And Mercedes seemed extremely comfortable building performance into the moments when the car was alive. That is why the third layer of the controversy became even more serious. The hybrid emergency shutdown trick. This one was different, because it did not just raise questions about fairness. It raised questions about safety. Under the new rules, cars had to reduce electrical energy deployment as they approached the timing line on a qualifying lap. In simple terms, the electric boost had to fade down. Teams were not supposed to keep maximum deployment all the way through the final part without that controlled reduction. The rule was meant to keep the system under control. but Mercedes and Red Bull reportedly found a way around it. They used an emergency shutdown function connected to the hybrid system. The function existed for real problems, for moments when a component needed protection, when something had gone wrong, when the car had to shut part of itself down to avoid damage. But according to the controversy, the function could be triggered intentionally near the end of a qualifying lap, allowing the car to avoid the normal reduction of electrical deployment for longer.